Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brent Nicol. I'm an ag conservation practitioner here with the Nature Conservancy. My background comes from ag retail, where I was a salesman for a couple of years, and then that transitioned me into a precision ag specialist, where I worked with yield data, variable rate fertilizer and seeding recommendations, and some soil sampling. And now, obviously, I'm with the Nature Conservancy, where I get to look at the farm from a different point of view, and that's by looking at in-field management, kind of like how I've always done, but I also get to look at edge of field and beyond the field to try to encompass whole farm success, not just in-field success. So today I'll be talking about how we can utilize yield data to make more accurate on-farm decisions across the acre. And to start off, there is a brief introduction as well as objectives of what I hope the audience can take away from this presentation. Then we'll jump right in and start to look at some yield data and how we can utilize it in what I think is a practical way. Then we'll look at different buffer analysis ran on this yield data to potentially see different impacts that it has on the field edge. After that, we'll add some numbers to productivity trends of a field to view its profitability. And at the end, I'll open it up to any questions after the key takeaways and acknowledgement slides. And Stephanie and AJ, if you want to watch the chat, if any questions start filtering through, feel free to stop me and we can get those answered. So, okay, so just starting off, let me get my laser pointer here. Okay, so just starting off, I'd like to discuss the origin of this data that we're about to look at. The original goal was to evaluate yield data to see productivity surrounding different types of in-field buffers. So once that data was gathered, our goal was to see how or what we could do to potentially manage these acres or these areas of the field differently, pending the results of those findings. So we decided to pursue this with the help of one of our trusted nutrient service provider partners, to help other NSPs or consultants think about potential services they could offer their clients, as well as showcase possible client retention methods. Our goal was also to show how these methods could potentially be economically beneficial to the farmer as well as environmentally friendly. So with that being said, let's just jump right into some of these findings, starting with single year yield data. So what can we learn from looking at a field year to year? So I'm sure the majority of you have seen maps like these. This yield data, as well as most of the information that's going to be shared in the upcoming slides, comes from this field that we collaborated on with our trusted NSP. So a couple of ways we can use these maps are we can accurately calculate removal when we apply this data to variable rate fertilizer applications. So in a lot of precision platforms, it is fairly simple to utilize yield data in this way to more accurately cover the removal of the past year's crop. So, for example, rather than supplying a fertilizer rec with a standard number of removal, like 200 bushel corn, for example, we can apply this type of yield data to create a more accurate spread map. So let's say the green areas averaged 220 bushel, for instance, and the red averaged 150 bushel, so substantially less. It would be more accurate to apply removal accordingly rather than spread the entire field for that average 200 bushel corn removal. Second, we can start to build the bigger picture after gathering yield data year after year. So it may seem like using yield data from 4 or 5 years ago might be a little bit redundant. But when you combine that data with the following years, it starts to create a more accurate picture of the field and its tendencies, which I'm going to cover more in depth in these next slides. So looking at yearly yield data, we can also see mistakes we made or potential areas of the field that may need our attention. So something like a sprayer skip, an area of low nitrogen due to maybe a mistake at side dress, wet holes, or other variables can potentially be seen and accounted for. So it also allows us to see other areas of the field that may need attention or managed differently the following year. So as an example, looking at this 2018 and 2020 corn yield data, we have a red area of the field on the lower west half. That's maybe a potentially low-lying wet spot. We could look at this area and view its productivity trends that we'll cover in the upcoming slides, and possibly come to the conclusion that we'd maybe be a little bit more profitable if that acre was put to something different, like a wetland, rather than consistently having a negative return on investment when we put it to row crop. But again, I'll cover that similar information as we get deeper into the presentation, especially when we start putting profitability to productivity. Okay, so let's look into multi-year data. Discussed in the previous slide was this year-to-year yield data, but what about the bigger picture after applying multiple years to the field? Adding more than 1 year of data to the field can help show different areas of the field that may need attention, which may not have appeared when looking at just a single year of yield data that you can see on the right-hand side. When trying to view multi-year productivity trends like this, it is important to consider either running the analysis using all crop types or just a single crop type. So when I used to do this, I personally like to run these types of analysis that you see on the left-hand side using a single crop type, so that there's as few variables as possible when comparing to a single year of yield data. But applying multiple crop types over multiple years can be really useful when trying to determine total on-farm productivity. If you, for example, were considering moving a specific area of row crop to something like a wetland or a CRP. So applying information to a field using multiple years not only can show areas that need attention, but it can also show areas that can help you alleviate concern of what looking at 1 year yield data could potentially show. So as an example, looking at the yield data on the right-hand side versus the multi-year data on the left, that multi-year data shows a more pronounced split on the field east of the ditch. So knowing more accurately where this field tends to change in productivity could help aid in a management program, maybe through fertility or even something like variable rate seeding. Also, as an example of alleviating concern, not just showing concern, the single year yield data map on the right-hand side shows an area of the field that seems to be a little less productive than normal right about here. So looking at the multi-year analysis on the left shows that this area of the field tends to be one of the most productive areas. Granted, this multi-year data on the left is only showing the average of 2 years of soybeans. But I think it still shows a really good representation of how, stacking multiple years of yield data can help you make more accurate on-farm decisions. So there are a lot of good things we can do right with yield data over a single year or multiple years. But what about these different types of analysis that I kind of touched on at the very beginning? So with the development of this public-private partnership that funds this project, we were able to analyze yield data from 4 different growers with 5 crop years of data that spanned over 20 different fields. During this process, a buffer yield analysis was ran on all 20 of these fields over 5 years with 9 different types of buffers. And those 4 crop types were corn, soybeans, wheat, and popcorn. But for the sake of time as well as relevance, to the broadest audience, only corn and soybean data are going to be shown. So for questions regarding wheat or popcorn results, please feel free to contact me after the presentation. I'll try to get that information over to you. But the yield buffer analysis was run in 40-foot intervals out to 240 feet from the field edge. And I'll show a picture of that in the next slide. And 9 different buffers were evaluated and their corresponding yields were evaluated. Excuse me. We then added a practical approach to the data by plugging in some rough figures from fertilizer prices back from the fall of 2021 to put some costs to productivity trends to show profitability. Granted, those fall fertilizer prices from 21 are not accurate to today's prices, but I think it still shows a good representation of what putting this profitability to productivity can do. So with that being said, what did this data tell us? So looking at the data at face value, it appears that within, so this is talking about woodlots, within that 0 to 40-foot buffer along the woods, there is an average yield drag of roughly 30.6%. So when we're talking about these buffer strips, these buffer analysis that were ran, this first strip that's closest to the woodlot that would be that 0 to 40 foot range. The next one out would be 40 to 80 and 80 to 120 and so forth. So this 30.6%, this percentage is taken into consideration the average between soybean and corn yield drag respectively. So to dial that in a little bit further, how we got that 30.6%, soybeans had an average yield drag on that 0 to 40 foot buffer of 23.1% and corn at 38.1%, both being just along the woodlots. So expanding this data out to the 40 to 80 foot buffer, we see yield drag decrease pretty substantially to 12.4% in corn and 5.5% in soybeans. So when put to row crop, roughly 10% yield drag in that 40 to 80 foot buffer. So these percentages were gathered and evaluated after looking at a combined 114 soybean data sets and 54 corn data sets when we were looking at woodlots. So looking at the drastic decrease in average yield along this specific evaluated buffer, what exactly was causing the yield drag, and what about the rest of the data sets? Okay, so like mentioned before, there's many other types of buffers that were evaluated from these findings. They include a 10, 30, 40, 50, and 70 foot grass buffer, as you can see right here, 30 and 40 foot buffers plus trees, and a 40 foot buffer plus woods. So numerous data sets for each corresponding buffer were evaluated, some having more data than others, as you can see here. But what we found was more inconsistent than what we originally thought we would see. So the yield data was, well, really consistently inconsistent, and it actually appears that yield deviation along each one of these buffers was really at most marginal between corn and soybeans. As you can see here, 1.5% yield drag, 6% yield drag. Granted, there's not very many corn data sets, just about even, and so forth. You can see, however, that there is a 10% yield drag when looking at these last two buffer types on the list, the 40 foot buffer plus trees and the 40 foot buffer plus woods. So this is actually consistent with the findings from the buffer analysis that we ran on the woods in the previous slide. As these two types of buffers, they actually start 40 feet out from the woods or the trees. So we're actually looking at a 40 to 80 foot buffer strip when looking at these two data sets.
Brent, there's a question in the chat. Tony wants to know, were any windbreaks within the data set evaluated?
So no, windbreaks were not evaluated. What we see here is just these grass buffers. So I guess, for instance, when you look down here, we could call that maybe a 30 foot grass buffer, for instance. As far as windbreaks go that run, I guess if there would be one here, no, we do not have anything evaluated like that I'm aware of. I could look into the wheat and popcorn. I don't have that information off the top of my head, though. Good question. Any other questions, Stephanie?
Nope.
Okay.
And for those of you that are in the room with us, we don't have a large group, so I mean, you're welcome to put things in the chat. I'll continue to monitor it, but you're also welcome to come off mute yourself. I think you're okay with that, Brent.
Yeah, that's totally fine. Just feel free to stop me whenever. Okay. Okay, so thinking back to what we originally had learned from the woodlots in the previous slide and its corresponding yield drag, we're actually seeing marginal to no yield drag from these different types of buffers when we take into consideration averages. As you all know, every field and every acre is different, but looking at multiple years of data and its trends, there appears to be inconsistent findings. So the take-home point here is there are a lot of variables present when trying to draw generalizations and productivity trends, but it appears crop productivity along certain buffer areas is not as poor as what may be expected or what I expected. Okay, so let's discuss below ground, specifically surrounding edge of field areas. So through this public-private partnership that funds this project, we've been working on analyzing some end row soil test numbers from a trusted NSP, which shows 126 unique fields that represent 308 crop years spanning 10 different growers. So each field having multiple years of data to it. The vertical black bar, where that big green arrow is pointing in the middle of the graph, dictates where end row soil test phosphorus is equal to the average soil test phosphorus. So from what we can see, the majority of the fields land on the right side of that field average soil test phosphorus line. So along the x-axis, you can see figures such as 0 to 25, 25 to 50, 50 to 75, and so on. This is the percentage of field average soil test phosphorus. So the bar just left of the black line, as an example, that says 75 to 100, that's dictating that 19 fields landed within 75 to 100% of the field average soil test phosphorus. So when you average out all of these values, it comes out to 130% respectively, meaning that on average, end rows are 30% higher in soil test phosphorus than the rest of the field. So with nutrient content, specifically phosphorus, being on average higher on the end rows, this could potentially help account for the inconsistencies and results we found with productivity surrounding all of the different types of buffers. This information, though, really in its early stages, could also help reiterate the importance of variable rate fertilizer application and possibly decreasing fertility needs based on yield data trends and these buffer analysis, which I'll cover a little bit deeper in the next slide. But I think I want to pause here. Stephanie, are there any questions regarding this? I know that was a lot of information I just threw at them.
There are no questions in the chat, but if anybody has a question, feel free to ask.
Okay, I'll give it 10 seconds here, and if we got nothing, I'll keep going. Okay. All right, keep chugging along. So going back to the buffer data, what can learner take away from this type of analysis? It gives us a better representation and visual of a section of a field's productivity. We can look at maps like these and determine that specific areas of the field may need some attention. When you look at the buffer data and bring the analysis out further from the woods, yield drag will decrease the deeper into the field you get and really be non-existent by the time the buffer analysis comes out to 120 feet, which is really off the end rows. We can also anticipate from the data highlighting edge of field soil test phosphorus that edge of field areas will on average be much higher in soil test phosphorus. Knowing this can help us make more accurate agronomic and economic decisions on the farm. Like mentioned before, every field is different and the buffer data was really consistently inconsistent. So viewing data as a general whole is beneficial to learning, the averages and what tends to happen, but it's still really important to apply management practices on a field by field basis. So let's dive in a little bit deeper. So for this slide, I'll be discussing different figures and costs when related to fertility for removal, specifically talking about an 1152 application, which is referred to as MAP. So going back to what we discussed, according to the data sets, there's a 30.6% yield drag from that 0 to 40 feet from woods. Also, from what we know, a 200 bushel corn crop will remove roughly 70 pounds of P2O5 per acre, which is equivalent, as you can see here, to 135 pounds of MAP fertilizer. Adding some math to this, within that 0 to 40 foot buffer, you can anticipate P2O5 removal to be about 48.5 pounds if the field was to average 200 bushel corn. And that buffer areas that we talked about follows that yield drag trend of 30.6%. So a MAP application after a 200 bushel crop would need 135 pounds of MAP to account for that 200 bushel removal. And that 0 to 40 foot buffer would only need 93 pounds to cover its removal on average. The fertility difference in the 200 bushel field average and the buffer area is roughly 40 pounds, so 42 pounds right there, roughly 40 pounds of MAP. As of October 1st of 2021, MAP was roughly $750 per ton. Granted, it's a lot different now, but $750 a ton is a figure. So knowing this information, the difference in 40 pounds of MAP could save the grower about $15 an acre along those specific buffers if variable rate fertility is applied to the field and that buffer analysis is utilized. And again, that's just MAP cost. That's not including potash cost, or if this information could change the application rate on something like a nitrogen pass. So for no more than just utilizing yield data, the bottom line of that grower could be positively influenced if the fertility program is tailored to his or her yield data or different type of analysis. So how much does this really save the grower? Is it really worth the time and effort to mess with yield data? So we're going to take a look at a different field as a separate example. So this is a normalized yield analysis ran on 3 years of corn data, being from 2016, 2018, and 2020. And it's showing yield spatial trends, so these productivity trends. The colors on the map are showing productivity trends, red showing less than 75% productivity, orange being between 75 and 95% productivity, yellow being 95 to 105% productivity. So that's what I'd consider the average producing areas for this map. And those green areas being above 105% productivity. So really the meat potatoes of the field. So for this map, what we really want to look at are the red and the orange areas. So looking at this field, where are we least productive and are we managing those acres the same as the rest of the field? The two areas, excuse me, the two areas that might need the most attention are along the woods and what appears to be a wet hole on the east end of the field. Looking at the spatial trends, we see that there are about 4 acres of this field that are below 75% productivity when the field is put to corn. So if the rest of this 1,000-acre farm, let's say, was to follow suit, we're nearly 5% of fields are hovering around or under 75% productivity. There could be potentially about 50 acres being mismanaged or overapplied. Now, 50 acres on a 1,000-acre farm, it doesn't seem like much, but when you start to put some financials to it, it could save a fair amount of money, as well as obviously improve nutrient utilization, so less lost or wasted fertilizer. As far as the money saved, applying 25% less according to those red 75% productivity acres over those 50 acres could save the grower about $12.75 per acre just in MAP cost, or roughly $640. Again, not accounting for potash or any other fertility costs associated with reducing application rates. Also, it should be noted, this is only accounting for areas that are also 75% under, so just those red areas. If we do apply these management practices to areas where production is consistently lower than the field average, so those orange areas as well, it could have even more of a positive economical effect. And again, that's just from utilizing this yield data. So for this slide, as we get close to wrapping up here, I think it's important to note that we shouldn't blame woodlots, obviously, for the yield drag. Though it is beneficial to manage farmed acres near the woods a little bit differently. So some benefits of woodlots: they provide windbreaks to the field, they support wildlife habitat, they help protect aquatic resources by preventing erosion, filtering farm runoff, and obviously they sequester a whole bunch of carbon from the atmosphere. Okay, so I'm going to go over some key takeaways from these findings from our trusted NSP, and then I can open it up to questions if there are any. First, what we discussed was single year yield data. Proper data utilization not only improves that bottom line, but it builds trust and value, specifically between the grower and their trusted advisor. It also is environmentally friendly, as these types of management practices can aid in better nutrient utilization, which improves environmental outcomes. It can really be a win for the advisor, a win for the environment, and a win for the grower's bottom line. Second, we discussed yield data buffer analysis. Buffer areas have in general been viewed as lower productive areas. In reality, they tend to function pretty similarly to the rest of the field, with the exception to buffers around woods. Also, we saw that end rows on average have 30% higher soil test phosphorus than the field average. But again, each field is different and should be managed independently. We then talked about adding some figures to look at field profitability and productivity. In the wake of high input prices, it could be beneficial to look at that marginal acre. There's a lot of opportunity to impact the bottom line rather than cutting a cost that may not be agronomically beneficial. And lastly, I think it's important to mention to definitely ask for help. Consult with a trusted consultant or agronomist when it comes to this type of data utilization. It's definitely a full-time job for some people, and it's for a reason. They can help positively impact that bottom line, as well as provide some potential insights. And then just the acknowledgement slides. Thank you to all these people for helping to get this data underway, and I'll open it up to questions now if there are any.
There is another question in the chat from Tony. Have you been able to tease out the yield data for the end rows?
No. So that when I talked about below the ground on that one slide about the end rows, that is still in its very early stages. There is yield data to it, absolutely. I haven't gotten my hands on it yet. As of right now, all I have is that that face value soil test phosphorus information from those fields. I am excited to see some of that yield data that comes off those end rows and see if it's any different compared to, I guess, what their buffer areas are as well. Good question. Any other questions?
This is Gary Pennell. I just unmuted. Thank you for the presentation. I'll start with that. I do wonder, had you done anything with nitrogen on these? I mean, looking at the variability of the field, like writing a prescription to variable rate nitrogen?
Not on these fields specifically. So in my old job as a precision ag specialist, I did do some scripts for nitrogen. And that was mostly coming out of like nitrogen modeling programs. So the one I used, I'm not putting in a plug for anyone. No, none's better than the other, but I used Granular at the time. And that pretty much just tracked, it was weather data, soil data, tissue samples, and so on. And that kind of helped us do a variable rate nitrogen application there. But for this, no, I've not done anything as far as nitrogen goes. This has been really revolving around phosphorus.
Okay. The other thing I would like to know, we actually have worked with Dr. Jay Martin and Nathan Stolpus on sharing our data set, because we've been doing some of this en-row testing for a little over 10 years. And so they recently just came out with that same data. And yes, we saw the same thing on the phosphorus was 25 to 35% higher on those end zones. And yeah, it was pretty notable. And there's a big cost savings if you use it. And I like where you're headed with this. I mean, the more we can collaborate together, people who are using this and put together to show the rest of the farmers where this can take us is extremely important, I believe.
Absolutely. I completely agree, Gary. I'll have to pick your brain sometime. You said 10 years you've been working on that, huh?
Yeah, we have like 520 fields that I have like 3 sets of samples. So they just recently crunched those numbers, looking at calcium, phosphorus, potassium, and everything. And on the whole trend, everything ran higher on those end zones. It's not necessarily along a woodlot. It's just where we're turning, or if there's a ditch along the edge. Yeah, we've separated those for a long time. And I finally got, so we could get somebody processing the numbers. I know they just took it to like Baltimore to kind of a national thing. So, but Nathan Stolfus or Dr. Martin would be really good. I mean, to kind of cover that, but yeah, I mean, we initiated it as a company 10 years ago.
That's great. That's fascinating. I would love to talk to you more in depth on that. Or I know Jay and Nathan, I'm working on a project with them, so I might pick their brain on it as well, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, and and like I say, on this yield part of things, I think it's critical. I have so many people who have the yield data and are not utilizing the information to make decisions and create, what can we change? How, I mean, it's a valuable tool that is not being used by hardly anyone, really. It's sad.
Oh, from my experience, I totally agree. It's not utilized nearly as often as I think it should be.
Well, the challenging part becomes it takes more management. So somebody has to get paid to do these things.
Yep.
And then you have someone who wants to sell product trying to initiate some of this. Well, they're going to sell less product. So they got to get paid somewhere. And that's part of the challenge. It needs to come from a farmer initiative that realizes what it can make them, how it can affect their bottom line paycheck wise, but then it has tremendous environmental impact as we've stressed. I mean, if you don't need to spread phosphorus along the borders of the field, you've created a buffer strip that's not going to affect his yield. It's powerful.
Absolutely. And when you take into consideration all the acres they farm, if they're not spraying or spreading the ends, that saves quite a bit of money as well over time.
Oh, it's tremendous economically. So yeah, I want to pursue. I mean, I'll get back with you when we're not all in this Zoom, but thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Gary. Appreciate it. Any other questions?
Yep. Brent, this is Tony. I just was curious if you've thought about or looked into some of these areas that are underperforming in the fields. And I know it's hard to get a farmer to fire those acres, no longer do anything with them, but there was some work I think was being done in Iowa and Illinois about bringing those into either CRP or something else if they were able to. So not only do you not have hundreds of dollars lost in that spot, but now you're potentially gaining on it. Have you been able to or thought about pulling some of that in, or does that apply to this as well?
I think that does apply to this for sure. Kind of when we start talking about that return on investment piece, like you said, as people start putting things into row crop and they start to see, after 5 years of productivity trends that they're losing however much money an acre. I think that point of discussion can definitely be brought up and when you put it to a wetland or CRP, now you're potentially making money on those acres. When I was in retail, there's a funny adage. The saying was a farmer will farm everything. If they could, they would farm the ditches. But I think we're starting to kind of move away from that mindset, in my opinion, where we are starting to look at a lot of this data coming off these fields and looking at productivity trends and looking at return on investment, where we can start to have those conversations about moving those poorer areas into something a little bit different. But I think that's for sure a talking point that could come out of this eventually. Good question.
One of the things in listening through, looking at those low yield locations and do we need to put as many input costs? Our experience as a company has been, we tend to spend more money on those less productive acres and have been able to bring up the yield. We may take the high production acre, it's got everything in good balance, spend less there, take it over to the acre that's not performing, bring that yield up. And so it brings the average of the field up at the same cost or in sometimes less, but using the VRT and not to reduce maybe an input cost, but knowing where the best money is spent, I guess, is a better way in some cases to put it. And we've had tremendous response to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Extremely good point. Couldn't agree more. I think once you start getting those areas up to, a manageable fertility level, you start to see that input cost kind of level out and go down a little bit from when you originally started.
I think one of the things I was thinking about here in Northwest Indiana is that we would have some low spots that drowned out, every year, every other year, whatever the case might be. And in those cases where there was zero, at what point is it justified to add additional tile to those spots? And you pick your number, $1,000, $2,000 an acre to put tile in. How long does it take to bring that, to get a return on that? But I agree with Gary's part about trying to hit those other lower yielding, but I was really thinking about those spots that are drowning out. We're getting a zero off of those once every 2, 3, 4 years.
Right. Good point. And I guess that kind of brings up a thought, Tony. I guess when you're looking at multi-year data, do you throw that data set out, or do you keep it in when you're looking at productivity trends? Can you keep it in? All of a sudden your ROI starts to creep down when you look at 5-year averages. I don't know. Good point though.
One of the other things we've done as a company, Brent, we're starting to look at the yield map, and I did a lot of it last fall, where we would take high yield locations and low yield locations, and then we geared special soil samples coming across those. So you're sampling by yield and then pursuing, okay, what's different about the high yield? What's different about the low? I realized many times there was a soil type change, but we were also pursuing biology and chemistry, looking at, okay, what can we change, or what's extremely different? And we learned so much from those samples that maybe doesn't show by our soil type and doesn't necessarily show when you lump things together by yield, but taking your very highest yielding, getting, those coordinates and sample and picking those extreme differences. We saw some really good learning curve from that. So might, something you may have pursued it.
No, I never have. As far as looking at the biology and the chemistry aspect behind it as well. I'd love to pick your brain on that, Gary. That sounds really interesting. I've done soil sampling according to yield zones before, but never gone that in depth with it.
So then what we pursued them with this year, we're actually following it into another year, and we're back taking, we have soil health testing, but we're also taking sap analysis to those same coordinates. So like multiple times we've done one sap in that location of the high yield, the low yield, and then we're taking another sap. We're doing a biology test during the year geared around GPS points and trying to collect a real data set over some time and see what, starts to really pop out as. We're actually going to take some bricks tests based on those. So start to look at bricks levels on those given coordinates, and can we pick something out that we're missing?
Yeah, I would be very interested to learn what you come up with on that. That sounds great. I guess any other questions or comments? Okay. Well, I guess with that, thank you to those of you that attended. It's very appreciated, and I thank you for all the good discussion and questions at the end. It's very appreciated.